In God we have our boast all day long. Psalm 44, verse 8. Hello, everyone. I'm Wally Wood. We welcome you to this another edition of the Revelation File Report. When we were last with you, we went into the first part of what I call my prophetic testimony. And we ran out of time before we could finish it. And I thought I would finish that episode today and take you to the rest of my story on this, because it's been a very intriguing and unusual journey for a guy whose background and training is in nothing more than just being a grocery clerk. And I've had a few other experiences along the way in journalism, broadcasting, things like this, but predominantly it's been in the retail industry. And the Lord has seen to it to call me into this particular ministry from as far back as the late 60s and early 70s. And I've had some wonderful experiences and some remarkable occurrences in this walk, and much of which has centered around an understanding and knowledge of where we are as a world and where this is taking us. The fact that this is the generation that was long prophesied that would see the very things that Jesus said would be seen in one generation of time before his return. And so my assignment, if you will, has always been in this area of end-time Bible prophecy, current events, trends, issues, things of this nature. This particular ministry that I have has long been educational, instructional, informational, as well as ministering and teaching. And I'm a bit offbeat from your normal average prophecy teacher. It's no aspersion on them. It's just how different the Lord has called this ministry to be. And it focuses predominantly in the area of world facts, things that are happening that are to some degree or another beyond our common knowledge as a people. And now he's opened this forum by which we can bring these things to you, the viewer, and show you how very late we are in the course of this generation. Jesus said in Matthew 24 that the generation that saw these things specifically would not pass away, wouldn't cease to exist until everything had been fulfilled, and that included his return. And so we are part of that generation. I call it the wrap-up generation. We are seeing things that are taking place that have never occurred before, especially in the area of advanced technology. And so this is where this ministry has been focused all my life. So I want to pick up where I left off last time in part 2 of my prophetic testimony. I don't have a conversion testimony like most people have. I've got a prophetic testimony and a healing testimony. So let's go right directly into this. This is part 2 of my prophetic testimony. As a refresher from last time, as far back as 1972, during the time of the Richard Nixon-George McGovern presidential campaign, is when I broke into the world of broadcast and print journalism. And I went to work for a Houston newspaper at the time called the Tribune, and at a local radio station, a very popular radio station at the time. And this is where I began to get my feet wet in the area of world trends, world news. It was at this time in 1972 that this newspaper gave me or assigned me as an investigative reporter into what I call the inside manipulators, those unknown faces and names that are behind the scenes, that are manipulating and coordinating world events toward their established goal, and that's a new world order. So as far back as 1972, that's when I began this research. And one particular evening, as I'm at the radio station doing the research into this material that was put in my hands, I had this material open on my left hand, and I had my Bible open on the right, and I was turned to Daniel chapter 2, reading about the dream of Nebuchadnezzar and the course of world history that would go forth from that point of Babylon. And that record in Daniel chapter 2, which I've shared here with you in the past. This one particular night at the radio station in the production room, as I'm doing this study, because we were an all-automated radio station at that time, I began to experience the dimming of the lights in the studio. And again, I'm not trying to go back over old material, but for the sake of viewers who didn't see that previous episode, I'm taking you through it real quickly here. On this particular night in August 1972, the lights began to dim. And I paid close attention to the music that was going out over the radio station. We were not experiencing a power drain of any kind, and yet these lights were dimming down. Now, I was the only one in the studio. The building was locked. This was a weekend midnight shift that I had. And we had no light dimmers. We had light switches. So at a particular point in the dimming of the lights, this extremely bright, brilliant beam of light came on over me and enveloped me. So brilliant that you couldn't see your shadows. And once this beam came on, then I heard an audible voice that said, "My son, I've shown you in my word what's going to happen. Now I'm going to show you how. And you're not to say a word without the documentation to back it up. I'll see to it you have all the documentation you need." End of sentence. The beam went off. The house lights came back on. I knew I had a visitation at that very moment. From that time forward, God has singularly earmarked this ministry to be a research-oriented ministry. And He's put in my hands documentation that I've shown here on this program in several different episodes that no one else has that I'm aware of. So, on Tuesday, November 10th, 1972, the National Election Day, I'm on a radio show here in Houston from midnight to 2 a.m. as a special guest. And my host is asking me questions because he had heard about my study in Bible prophecy and world events. I was already in the news at the time. So he asked my opinion, my feedback on what I felt would be the outcome of that morning's election. The polls were going to open 5 hours later at 7 a.m. And so I began to share with him my insight into what I'd learned and what I felt was happening. I made the comment that Mr. Nixon was going to win this election and that George McGovern would lose, and that this was the biggest sham of an election in American political history at that time. I said that Mr. McGovern was the best campaign manager that Nixon could ever hope for. And I made the comment, I said, if we continue on the same course we're on right now, do not be surprised if the man who replaces Mr. Nixon becomes this country's first unelected president. That was 2.5 months before Watergate, 2.5 years before Gerald Ford came in unelected. And people were calling in that night saying, "You're out of your mind, you're crazy, you don't know what you're talking about." So that was my first prophecy. But with that and with their response came the second prophecy, that I saw no more than 5 administrations in this country as a free nation. And something was going to happen between the 3rd and the 5th administration that would guarantee that change. So that was the second prophecy. So what happened next? Well, as history shows, on January 20th, 1972, Richard Nixon was elected or was installed as President of the United States with Spiro Agnew as his vice president. It wasn't very long before they went after Spiro Agnew, and he was thrown out of office due to scandal, and he was replaced by the Speaker of the House, Gerald Ford, on October 10th, 1973. A few years after that, Mr. Agnew wrote a book called Go Quietly or Else, and he tells the story behind his being forced out of the White House. Very interested reading. It came out in 1980. But following that, of course, on August 9th, 1974, Mr. Nixon resigns under the scandal of Watergate, and Mr. Ford becomes our first unelected president in American history. He becomes president number 2 in this lineup of 5 administrations in my second prophecy. Following him was Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter came in 1977, was installed as the 3rd president in this chain of presidents. He was followed by President number 4, Ronald Reagan, in 1981. And what happened in Mr. Reagan's administration was the fact that he brought in George Bush, who was well known as a deep insider to the New World Order and things of this nature. He became President number 5 from the prophecy in 1972. And it was Mr. Bush that introduced the country to the thinking of a new world order in his State of the Union address in 1991 before Congress, and then later in the Oval Office in his broadcast there. So here we had the 5 presidents, and something was going to happen between the 3rd and the 5th that would guarantee the change of the fact that we would cease to be a free nation as we'd always been in the succession of these presidents, in beginning of the 4th presidency. The 5th president was George Bush. He introduced the concept of a new world order before the public, and we've been on that track ever since. On Monday, September 25th, 1978, I'm standing in front of a Coke machine at work to get my Coke, and the spirit of prophecy hits me, and I found myself thinking in terms of then Pope John Paul I, who was elected to office on August 26, 1978, and I felt the impulse to declare that no, this was the wrong pope. This man was outside the step of time, outside the cycle of history. He was not the pope we were to be looking for at that time, that he would be replaced by a more international pope traveling the world, preparing the way for the last pope to come. This is what I said in front of that Coke machine. Well, this was September 25th. 3 days later, a lady comes through my line, asked me if I had seen the news. I said no. She said, the Pope is dead. He died suddenly, unexpectedly. He was in office for 33 days. He was followed on October 16, 1978, by Pope John Paul II, the most widely traveled pontiff in history, according to Catholic News and historical documents. Quoting Catholic News Service, his 104 trips outside Italy made Pope John Paul II by far the most widely traveled pope in history, end of quote. So again, here I was speaking prophetically, an utterance, and it came to pass in short order with Pope John Paul II. Sunday, March 29th, 1981, I'm ministering in a church in Conroe. I'm sharing with them what I've been sharing with you, my prophetic testimony, line by line, just down the track. At one point in my sharing of this prophetic ministry, these words came out of my mouth, quote, the time is now right for there to be a public assassination attempt upon the president, speaking of President Reagan, but it will fail. It will be a warning shot to get him to cooperate with the internationalists, which he is not prone to do, end of quote. That was Sunday, March 29th, 1981. The next day, Monday, March 30th, the assassination attempt took place. It hit world headlines everywhere. I told a friend that day when we got the word, before we ever saw the television set, I said, it's a .22 bullet. It entered the president's left side, striking a certain rib. He will survive this, but he won't be the same. It would be 3 hours later, they would sit in front of a TV set and see for the first time the news of it being a .22 bullet hitting the left side. So that took place in 1 day's time. Wednesday, March 3rd, 1983, I'm having lunch with Dr. Hilton Sutton, well-known prophecy teacher in Humboldt, Texas, at his office. And among the things that we talked about, I told him, I said, Menachem Begin of Israel and President Reagan of the United States are the last of God's men sitting on seats of power in the world today. After that, there'll be no more. Mr. Begin will leave first. His departure will be peaceful. But I can't speak so much for the peacefulness of Mr. Reagan's departure. In the time frame between Reagan's departure and Reagan's departure, the world will enter into a transition into the tribulation after Reagan is gone. And that's what I said on March 3rd, 1983. August 18th, 1983, I had a dream. The Lord seldom ever uses prophetic dreams with me, but this particular night, he did. I found myself in a large auditorium at a beauty pageant. From the left of the stage comes Mr. and Mrs. Reagan into the auditorium with their entourage. They come directly below my point on a second balcony level, and I'm watching it on television. They enter into a clearing zone between the seats, and into the spotlight comes Jody Powell, President Carter's former press secretary and a special news correspondent for ABC at the time. As they're shaking hands, I see this white flash, like that of a light bulb going off in my eyes. When my eyes cleared back to normal, I saw Mr. and Mrs. Reagan on the floor in a pool of blood. I saw security forces pulling Mr. Powell aside and mass pandemonium in the auditorium. I woke up I said, Lord, what was that? I got no answer. But within a matter of days, the Lord told me to write this down and a series of events that followed that. And he impressed me to get into the hands of a local Houston realtor who was at that time, in 1983, known to be one of the largest supporters of Pat Robertson's 700 Club. Well, I knew this man. I'd taught in his home a few times. So I called him on the phone. I read to him this letter, and he said, get it in my hands. And so I drove it out to his office the next day, that following week of September 1983. We prayed over it, laid hands on it, and sent it off. I left and went back home to Conroe. In the time frame, within a matter of weeks, at the radio station I was working at, we're watching the 700 Club, as was our tradition to do. On this particular day, Pat Robertson is speaking. He says, we've just received a letter from our good friend in Houston, and it includes a prayer from a young man in the Houston area that is a suggestion that the president not go to the Philippines, which was an island nation known for their beauty pageants. We have received this letter. We've prayed over it. We believe that it's of the Lord, and we'll do everything we can to get it into the president's hands. Within a matter of weeks, just a few weeks after that, the president decided not to go to the Philippines. And that's how the Lord took a prayer from Tomball, Texas, and got it into the hands of the White House in about 2 weeks' time. It changed the course of history. In 1975 to 1976, during the time that Mr. Ford was in office as president, I'd made the prediction that if he and Jimmy Carter would agree to a public television debate, that Jimmy Carter would win the presidency because Carter had more of a television appeal and Ford did not. And as we all know, Carter became president. In that same time frame, I also put out another prediction having to do with Isabel Perón of Argentina. I had seen a picture of her emerging from an airliner, and her military generals were surrounding her. And I sensed in my spirit that these men would replace her very soon. So I predicted that she would be replaced by a military junta, and it took place in 1976. At the same time, I also predicted that Indira Gandhi of India, Prime Minister of India, would be replaced by a no confidence vote on the part of the Indian Parliament. That took place in 1977. On Tuesday, September 4th, 2011, I'm working at a grocery store. A customer comes up to me and begins to talk about how pleased he was that we finally had a Christian president in the White House, speaking of Mr. Bush Jr. And he asked me to give some feedback on that. We talked a little bit. I said, but this isn't what is of interest to me right now. What we should be seeing very soon is a catalytic, catastrophic event that's going to turn this administration more toward Orwellian techniques than ever before in the history of this nation. Something's going to happen very soon that will force this administration to go Orwellian on us, in which our privacy would be systematically lost, and we would be tracked as a result of this one big event. That was Tuesday, September 4th, 2011. On the 11th of September 2011, the towers in New York are hit by the terrorists. I was at work. I didn't know anything was happening at that time. The phone rang. There was my sister. And she called to tell me what she had just seen on television, this plane flying into the tower. And she was very, very upset. And she asked me what this meant, because she knew of my prophecy background and what a response I would have. Well, before I could give her a response, the second plane hit the second tower, and she screamed. And now she's borderline hysterical. And she's pleading with me, what is this about? Ladies and gentlemen, the first words out of my mouth as I began to give her answer were not words I was planning on saying. It was Osama bin Laden. My sister paused. She said, Wally, this is no time to be speaking in tongues. What are you saying? And I told him the background of Osama bin Laden going back to the Watergate years, back to when Colonel Oliver North gave testimony. And actually, it wasn't the Watergate years, it was during the Reagan administration, the Iran Gate. And Colonel North made the comment to the question, is there any man on earth that you fear? He said, yes, Osama bin Laden. And he gave the first introduction to the background of this terrorist to the American people before Congress. And that's what came forth as I spoke to my sister that day. It would be hours later, a day or so later, that it would become clear to the American people that Osama bin Laden was behind the attack on September 11th, 2011. July 2016, I'm having breakfast with a local TV anchor here in Houston, and our talk goes to the campaign of 21 candidates for president that year, 2016. And so we got talking about it, and he asked me, he said, what's your impression? Who do you think is going to win the presidency? And I told him, I said, Donald Trump. And my friend said, how can you be so sure? And so I began to unveil to him the fact that the present status of the world is looking for a strong leader. And everybody's talking about it. Even world leaders are saying we need someone that's strong, that has a strong hand to world events, that can take control where we're losing control. And I told him, I said, because of that, Mr. Trump is the strongest of all the candidates, and he will win this next election. Well, as it turned out, on Monday, November 7th, the day before the election, my friend texted me on the phone. He says, we'll know tomorrow whether you know your stuff or not, won't we? If you're right, I owe you a big lunch. If you're wrong, I'm getting as far away from you as I can because you're a false prophet. And then he just put in parentheses, just kidding. But that was the text I received from him the day before the election. On Tuesday, November 8th, 2016, Election Day, Donald Trump stumps the nation by becoming the president, by being elected. That day, I received a phone call from my friend. He says, okay, I owe you that big lunch, my friend. Now you've got my attention. How did you know for sure? What does this mean going forward? And indeed, it raises the question, what does this mean going forward?
The Antichrist is alive. Technologically, we're there. Whether he be God or devil, he's on the scene. Once that man was conceived, his course was set. We're in those days. Do any of you feel like that you are now on the threshold of the fulfillment of the rest of what's been prophesied in Scripture? I do.
From 1981 to 1984, I was part of another massive national ministry in this country as news director for one of their numerous radio stations across the country. And it was while there I started the Christian News Network on radio. And we utilized this particular network of stations in our network of the Christian News Network. Intended and designed to have professional journalists, reporters, anchors who happen to be Christian, reporting world news from a biblical prophetic perspective. and it became a very, very popular network that we started. It was also during this time frame that I began to write manuscripts. I had my own national radio show called The World in Review, and we produced a number of these manuscripts, all of which were prophetic. Again, taking from current world trends and tying it in with end-time Bible prophecy. These are just a small sample of the manuscripts that you see here that we produced at that time. And currently, I have a book. In this book, in 1 Corinthians 2, verses 6 through 8, we read, "Yet we do speak wisdom among those who are mature, a wisdom, however, not of this age, nor of the rulers of this age who are passing away. But we speak wisdom in a mystery, the hidden wisdom which God predestined before the ages to our glory, the wisdom which none of the rulers of this age has understood. For if they had understood it, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory." The book is called The Mystery, Heaven's Secret Story. There's a story behind the story of our redemption that, according to Scripture, was kept a secret by God himself until the fullness of time. When Jesus said, "It is finished," on the cross, is it possible that he was referring to something beyond the act itself, to something that had roots before creation? I want to invite you to get a copy of this book, and you can get a copy of it by going to our website, wallywoodministries.com, and ordering it from there. It is very deep. It's got 300 scriptures in it, but it takes you into the plan that God put in motion before creation. I invite you to get your copy. We'll be talking about this in an upcoming episode. In the meantime, I thank you for watching. I'm Wally Wood, and we invite you to come back for another episode soon.
You have been watching the Revelation File Report with Wally Wood, a Wally Wood Ministries production from Houston, Texas. You are able to support the ministry by donating at wallywoodministries.com and by mail at Wally Wood Ministries, P.O. Box 42005, Houston, Texas 77242. Wally is available to present full 2-hour forums in your city called the Revelation File News Forum. For more details, contact Andy Valadez at 713-560-3348 or by email at andy@andyvaladez.com. The Revelation File News Report is a weekly update of global trends in the news as it aligns with end-time Bible prophecy. Tune in again next time and be sure to like and share this channel.